I've long said I've always wanted to hold a conference where there is no agenda, just hallway time or just breakfast time, because I love doing these events because it brings people together who don't get to see each other very often. I have an excuse, I'm from Chicago, but you all live fairly close by. We should get together more often. The American Center for Children and Media will do what it can to ensure that that happens. I'm David Kleeman, I'm the president of the American Center for Children and Media. On a call to prepare for today's briefing, I asked Warren Buckleitner asked me what I hoped participants would take away, how I was defining a home run for today's session. And I answered that I wanted everyone to understand that we know a lot more about the influences of screen-based media on young children than both good and bad, than the very shrill and polarized debate would lead us to believe. But there are still a lot more questions than there are answers. I also want everyone to go back to work armed with some new resources about how children grow and learn, inspired with new ideas for contributing to children's healthy development, but also committed to asking and answering the very difficult remaining questions and evolving some best practices based on those answers. Arguments about children and media aren't going to easily abate, but the best way to blunt them, in my mind, is to create responsible, thoughtful, engaging media that kids love and that parents respect. The American Center for Children and Media plays two simultaneous roles, and this event fits both perfectly. As a creative professional development center, we're devoted to finding new voices, new perspectives, and sharing them with the people who are most responsible for creating, distributing, and studying screen-based media. As an executive roundtable for the children's media industry, we work to ensure that the leaders of the industry, the decision makers, have the information and the perspective that they need to do the right thing for kids in ways that are also sustainable for the industry. And in both those roles, we're striving to change the public dialogue about children and media. It seems to have become very fashionable to bash and blame media but we find that benefits no one. For example, it's really pointless to debate whether parents should or shouldn't allow children media exposure, because the fact is, and has been shown by a lot of research, they do. TV and digital media aren't going to go away. Indeed, they're expanding. They're migrating to all kinds of new platforms and uses, and so the productive and forward-looking discussion instead is how do we define and achieve high-quality media, and how do we support parents in its responsible use. So that's why as soon as I first met Lisa Guernsey and heard about the book, her book, and even more so after I had a chance to read an early edition of the book, or an advanced copy of the book, I knew we needed to organize this event, a way to share her thoughtful, reasoned, very well-studied work with you. Into the Minds of Babes is exactly what this issue needs. It's written primarily for parents, but it's also a goldmine for all of you, writers, producers, development executives, telecasters, public affairs, and promotion experts. It's written with a parent's engagement, a journalist's wary eye, and a mystery writer's sense of exposition. We're incredibly lucky also that this event was timed just as the California-based advocacy group Children Now was releasing a new literature review, documenting what we know about preschoolers, learning, and interactive media. The report is thorough, it's very well structured, it's especially useful in recommending an agenda going forward. And there are copies of that report. Some of you have gotten it already. There are copies upstairs on the table. The book is for sale on the tables upstairs afterwards. And there's another report. I'll say that there's another brand new monograph on preschoolers and TV, and this one is by Faith Rogo of the Alliance for Media Literate America and Insiders Educational Consulting. She couldn't be here today, but she sent copies of the paper, and that's upstairs as well. I've asked Lisa to begin by introducing Into the Minds of Babes, and then we'll follow that with a conversation about some of the book's findings and implications for children's media industry. And then Christy Glovke, the director of the Children and Media program at Children Now, will summarize their study, and then we've set aside the last half hour to open the floor. We have a lot of knowledge, we have a lot of expertise resident throughout this room, so while we ask you to keep comments brief, and so that we can get to as many as possible, we're also eager that it be a discussion, not just a question and answer. To interview Lisa and to moderate the discussion, I'm really thrilled that we were able to invite Warren Buckleitner, who's the editor of Children's Technology Review. He's a long-time, perceptive, analytical observer of how and why young people use various media. We had a wonderful conversation about the need to be skeptical but not cynical optimistic but not wide-eyed in this time of overwhelming change in children's media. And that's a role that Warren is well accustomed to, if you know about his highly regarded journal, but also his highly regarded Dust or Magic conference. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Warren Buckleitner.
Thank you. What a wonderful honor to be here with all these smart people. It kind of is a little scary, isn't it? Now, according to my agenda, you're supposed to introduce your book. Is that right?
Indeed, yeah. So I can get started. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to write this book. I am a journalist by training, and before my kids were born, I was writing about software, cell phones, online education projects. As soon as I had a child in my arms, I suddenly realized that there's this thing called a television set. And boy, I as a parent don't really know all that much about how my own child is absorbing and learning from what she sees on the TV set. I started to get really involved in looking at this question when I had a newborn and a 2-year-old. If any of you out there have had 2 children and you've been at home with them for long periods of time, and you know what it's like to try to be juggling everything, you know that there are definitely many moments where you're going to have the TV on or pop in a video. And I just started to wonder, well, gosh, you know, at age 18 months, what are my children really understanding about what they see? At 24 months, are they getting it a little bit more? And how are they starting to comprehend what they get from the TV? So I decided to dig in. And what I really wanted to do was go beyond these 2 extremes. As a parent, I felt pulled in 2 directions. On the one side, I kept hearing more and more about the harm that could come from putting my young kids in front of a TV set, even for short periods of time. And that really was what I was doing. It was maybe 30 minutes a day, sometimes an hour, sometimes an hour and a half if I couldn't seem to get the baby to nap, and I had to be pacing her upstairs for 30 minutes while my other one was watching. So I was hearing a lot of bad news. On the other hand, I would walk the halls of Target, and I would see all of these video products, you know, with splashing graphics telling me that I should be stimulating my baby, and here's a way to give them some more cognitive development. So I wanted to kind of find out what the science really told us about these 2 things, and where parents can find a path through it. What I came down to really is looking at what video can do for young kids and at what ages, and what it can't do for young children at what ages. I decided to frame my book around what I call the 3 C's: content, context, and your child. And it was really the research that took me to those places. I started to understand more about how much content matters and how much the context matters after looking at some really good independent academic research on the subject. So there's a lot we can say, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation about it. I want to leave you, though, with a little scene from home that might just kind of give you a sense of how young kids come to media. I know a lot of you see in your testing how young children seem to understand things, and they can sometimes ask the most hilarious, wonderful questions about what they're seeing. So there was a moment, this was back many, many months ago when my youngest just turned 3, and we were on an airplane, and my 5-year-old had been watching Alice in Wonderland. She'd been becoming absolutely enthralled with Alice in Wonderland after we were here in New York seeing it at the Children's Museum. So she's 5. I thought she'd seen enough of the story she could kind of maybe get something out of the video. She'd understand it. My 3-year-old was watching too. And at the end of watching Alice in Wonderland, I asked Gigi, my 3-year-old, I said, so what was that about? And she said, well, that was about a little girl who went down to the basement, but she didn't use the stairs. And then I said, aha. And I said, and then what did she do when she was down there? And she said, well, she was scared because her mommy and daddy weren't with her. And I really thought that really captured a lot of what, what the 3-year-old was kind of bringing to and trying to understand about what they're seeing. So anyway, I'll leave it at that, and I really look forward to hearing all of your questions.
Okay, everybody, pull out your baby pictures. Well, what this really is a lot about children, and what was fun to me about this book was when a smart journalist has children and really has questions that are intrinsic and will not settle for ignorance. And when you, I just wanted to, for those of you who have not gotten this book yet, I was wondering if you could actually read the first sentence, because it tells a lot about the voice.
Okay. My introduction to baby Einstein came in a moment of panic. I was a new mother with a colicky 5-week-old baby, desperate for anything that might calm her. Try baby Mozart, advised one of my closest friends who had just emerged alive from 6 months of colic with her daughter. We call it baby crack.
So, a couple of things that are striking about this whole book is it's in first person. And Lisa, you've written for New York Times and so on. It's a little bit different voice for you.
Yes, I felt very vulnerable actually when I got started on this, because I'm used to just taking, a quote from an expert, another quote from an expert, and putting it together.
Yeah, and so combining that first person, which I think is kind of blog, people are used to that now, with the amount of information and amount of references. I'm just wondering how many people here are in the book or have been quoted that you know of? We could read it. So there will be questions and answers if you want to do any corrections.
Yes.
Forget about it. It's already impressive. But it is striking, and it's fun to be here right in the center of children's media and have so many people who make the stuff that our children are consuming. And so that's one of the questions is that I want to make sure we cover is, what would you say to people based on your experience of going through this? Actually, let me jump to another question. Who's watching your kids right now?
Good question. Actually, they're both one's in preschool, one's in kindergarten. Hopefully they're being well taken care of.
Okay. And I just was wanting to make sure, because I happen to have, after the baby crack wears out, I have another thing here that they might be. This is a Nintendo DS. This will easily get your children from age 6 until 12. And then you can get them a PlayStation 3 or a Wii.
Yeah.
And you're done.
Yeah.
So always keep one of these in your pocket. You never know when you run into kids. So this was in first person. I did learn a lot about you and you will about Lisa, and that she discloses quite a bit. And the girls were born here in Manhattan, or in?
Actually, I was pregnant in Manhattan, but we moved down to Virginia by the time my first one was born.
And so, like, here you are. You did the story for the Washington Post, and so you're cognizant of sort of the debate. But when did you start to realize that there's such a mess in the literature?
Yeah, well, I did a story for the Washington Post in 2004, and I wrote it because I'm sure you're very well aware of the article that came out, the journal article in Pediatrics that came out earlier in 2004, that was linking attention problems to TV viewing at very young ages. And I gotta say, that came out when I had, the newborn in my arms and the 2-year-old watching. And I was just like any other parent there. It just really made me go, oh my gosh, what do we know about brain development? So when I wrote this story for the Washington Post, I still was in that mindset of worry, really. I really just didn't know exactly what to think. And I had been through the journal article, and I'd interviewed the researchers, and I'd also, at that time, found many very thoughtful people to bring some light to the idea of, well, let's think about the age at which children actually learn from what they see on screen. How is this observational learning working on a video screen? So I wrote the story, though, and as you know in the book, it kind of was a worrier story. It certainly was from my point of view as a parent, and it brought out a lot of the struggle that families today face. But I kind of ended it saying, I'm just going to turn off the TV and have my child play Play-Doh. Then I started getting more and more response to that article, and I realized that I was kind of missing something in there. People just have so many more questions about, well, what can video really do? Yes, I'm going to make sure they have Play-Doh, But for those 30 minutes a day that we are going to be watching, what should we even just be looking for in it? So that's when I started going back to the researchers I talked to, looking at citations in their research, trying to find more. What I wanted to do was go beyond, to look at the child development research really, and try to pick out the places in child development research where they've used video with children. And they weren't necessarily trying to get at the question of whether it was good or bad, but they were trying to just understand how children learn. So I thought, well, maybe those articles and that research could inform us a little bit more about what children are getting from these shows that they're watching.
And some of the way that the book is structured, I have a sister who's an attorney, and we have these debates, because when I would go on a trip, I, being a sane adult, had a DVD player for at the time of a VCR. And I grew up in Michigan, and my wife and I, both degrees in child development, are happy. I mean, basically, whatever you can do to keep the environment in the minivan sane for 12 hours.
I hear you.
Hello.
I hear you.
I mean, Shrek, whatever. R-rated, I don't care. Throw it back. We want to. So, but my sister, really smart, but she just has this thing. You have a screen in your car, you're going to ruin your kids. And there's so many smart people, and then there's all this guilt out there. And I think that's what was always frustrating to me, was the amount of both sides using the guilt, but so when I saw this book, it's like, she actually asked to see references. Oh, this is so refreshing. And so it was very nice to see. There are a lot of dots in this debate. I mean, you basically have children on one side. Children are very, she actually, Lisa talks about the different stages that kids go through. I mean, a 2-year-old is very different than a 4-year-old. And then media is so fractured as well. So there was a lot to go through. You must be exhausted.
I am, and I gotta say, I'm such an observer. I think my kids are sick of me. I mean, I'm the one with the notebook out while they're watching, and I've got the camera clicking while they're watching, while they're playing the computer, and I'm like, Mommy, put it away, just watch, because I'm trying to figure out how they respond. I
saw her after a panel in Washington. I think it was the living room, the teacher in the living room, Kaiser thing. I see this. I didn't really know Lisa at the time that well. I was just like intently. I mean, and oh man, who is that? She's really intense. I think you had Christakis, Dr. Christakis, and you can't have corner. You're really asking those questions. Thinking, wow, those are great questions. So congratulations on asking those questions. They were not.
Well, there's still a lot of questions to ask. There's just, as you would say, connect the dots. But the more I talk to preschool parents, that's what I've been doing lately, I keep getting questions asked to me, and I'm like, gosh, I didn't actually find an answer to that in the research, and I really don't know the answer to that question.
She covers in this, if you look at the contents, organized around like what exactly is this video doing to my baby's brain? And we've always wondered about those things, but what videos are too scary for my child?
Which is the question. I think a lot of parents out there they're just getting a lot of media. Often it's gifts under the Christmas tree or whatever, and they don't really know. Okay, well, all right, we got Lion King this year for Christmas. Is my 3-year-old ready for Lion King? I mean, for a lot of parents, they're just throwing up their hands. They just don't really know. They hear about a couple of good programs. They hear maybe PBS is good. There's kind of a dearth of information out there on just, well, what's going to be too upsetting for them and what isn't. And I have to say, on some of the questions about what's too scary, I would love to see a lot more research on that, because I had parents asking me, well, my child is now waking up with nightmares. Is it because of what he or she saw yesterday? And what's really going on in his or her brain? And I found that at these very young ages, children are having a hard time maybe even understanding the real distinction between real and fantasy. So a lot of parents will say, oh, don't worry, it's not real. It's not real that this guy, is getting his head chopped off or whatever. It's not real. But for a 2 or 3-year-old, that explanation may not really mean anything to them. It's a pretty hard concept for a 2 or 3-year-old to get what's real or what's not. So
just one of the many sticky issues and big issues. And one of the things that we were basically looking at an explorer here. She's been exploring in this world and going behind the scenes. Did you find anything, and I asked you this earlier, but any researchers that you thought were really doing some interesting work that?
Yeah, so many actually. There's a woman named Georgine Trossett, and she's down at Vanderbilt. And actually, you see her name written there, it looks like Trossett, but it's actually pronounced Trossett. And she's got a whole lab set up down there where she's trying to get at how toddlers learn words from video or from social interaction or from a combination of the social interaction / video setup. She's the one who did, sometimes it's called the webcam study. I don't know if you guys, I'm sure a lot of you know about it. It looked at how if a video shows children or parents can be a social partner for them, if it's somebody who talks to them as if they're able to kind of respond, setting up a situation in which the child can get kind of engaged in the questions asked and feel like they're having a contingent relationship, that in those situations, even at 24 months, children will start to recall more of what they see and they'll be able to learn more from what they see on the screen. And so a lot of programs out there are already doing this, and a lot of you all know about how powerful that moment is, that moment of participation. But so anyway, Georgine Trossett is I think she watch her stuff. It's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of her lab. There's some work by Louise Mayers, I think it's the University of Wisconsin, and she's trying to look at how much children get a sense of the resolution that happens in a show when there's so much conflict. So in other words, the shows that are aimed at preschoolers that spend a lot of time on the problem and only for the last 5 minutes of the show really get to how to solve the problem. And everyone hugs and we're all okay. She's trying to get at whether kids at these young ages, if they're just getting the problem, if that's the only thing that's really kind of in their mind, and maybe they're never really fully comprehending or remembering the resolution. So she's a good one to watch. And then a lot of you all, I'm sure have heard of Dan Anderson at the University of Massachusetts. And right now they're doing some eye tracking work up there, and they're trying to get a sense of how young children, and we're talking very young, I mean he's looking at babies, how they track what's on the screen, and if they can follow where a character moves across the screen, and if they can understand cuts between, say, going off screen and coming back on in a different place. So it'll be really, I think there's a lot coming.
There's a lot coming, and also technology's changing. And I know you were a technology reporter for many years, and you're interested, so there's a little geek in there.
Yeah.
What do you think in 10 years from now when screens are giant and maybe more interactive? What's that mean for babies and toddlers? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, or even high definition, when things start looking more and more like what they're seeing out in their backyard, how is that going to affect young children? I think there's two things that we can think about. The first is that children are seeing media being created more than they were 10 years ago. So they're seeing mom and dad with a video camera in their hands, creating something and then putting it on the screen, and then they get to watch it. So maybe we'll see more media literacy at younger ages because these young kids are getting a sense of how it's made. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, there's no way kids could have seen that really happening unless they happened to be, the son of someone who worked for Sesame Street. But now they're seeing it all the time, and they're seeing their own faces on TV all the time because their own, the photos on our computer screen in our kitchen. I mean, my kids are getting a huge narcissistic complex from seeing themselves on the screen every single day.
When I was teaching preschool, the TV and cameras were first coming out. Camera was really big, and I was really excited about it. But I used to plug it right in and just have a live stream. So it was the Sears, sort of the appliance effect. You see your face, and it was amazing to me how babies and toddlers and they realized I move, it moves. That causality is quite powerful.
Let me tell you though about the flip side of it though, and I think this is kind of worth keeping in mind, is that as much as these larger screens and high definition can make it seem so real that you kind of say, gosh, children must to be learning the same way they're learning from a person in front of them. There's some research at the University of Washington that gives me some pause in that area with really young children, with infants, because I described it in the book, but there was an experiment set up there to try to get at if children can start to learn another language. You know, everyone wants their children to be bilingual these days, so it was set up to enable children to hear Mandarin Chinese spoken to them. So in one group they had children on a blanket listening to a speaker who was in the room talking to them in Mandarin. And then in the other, they set up the room exactly the same, and they made sure it was a very big screen behind them. And they made sure that the person speaking was the exact same person wearing the exact same thing, with the same kind of distance to the children on the blanket. And yet, those children who watched the video version did not pick up the phonemes and the distinction in language the way the children who had it in person demonstrated to them did. And the graduate students who set this experiment up, before they got the results, they thought, oh, surely this is going to be just as good, if not maybe even better. It's so clear, it's so crisp. And yet the babies, they really responded to that in-person interaction more so.
And I think that one of the things that's good about this book is, you're probably picking up I liked it, but that it isn't sort of, you know, and all these sort of how-to parenting books have lists, this is what you should do. This doesn't do that. Lisa gives the 3 C's, which, and one of those is your child. And so it sort of it flips it around. It says, parents, there's only one person in the world that knows your kid, and that's you. And also, I think a recurring theme is you can't replace real and concrete and hugs and the things that, you know, and that feels good. And you had the thing about the songbird.
Yes.
You'll learn a lot of cool facts in here too, you know.
So random.
Yeah, a lot of cool terms. You can sound smart at parties, just throw out some of these terms. But the fact that you can't replace real human interactions, and so the framework, the 3 C's, I think it's I think, you know, it does sort of put the responsibility back on the parent as a consumer. One of those is content, and a lot of content is in this room, people choosing content. What do you think about that? I mean, are you happy with the content? Would you like to see better?
Well, I gotta say, I came to this thinking, oh, maybe I'll only find 1 or 2 shows that are using some of the traits that I'm seeing in research. But even in the 2 years that I was doing the research for this book, I found more and more programs that met some of that criteria. I started to give a list when I talked to preschool parents and moms about, and I think a lot of these you will know. So you know, you can add to the list actually after we're done. But I started to tell parents to look for repetition, to look for review, moments where a child just has a chance to hear again what he or she just learned. And again, we're talking about different ages, right? So a lot of this is after age 2. And ask me about, if we have time, what happens right around age 2, because it's fascinating how children are learning at those ages. But if there's repetition, if there's moments for review, if there's a linear storyline, and if Dora the Explorer with the map really does this, it tells the kids, here's the storyline, here's where we're going, and it's just straight on down the line. There's no, you know, there's no stopping for a bathroom break. There's just, you're gonna go straight on down through that. There's on-screen labeling of what's happening so that a child can see exactly what they're talking about. The words that are said have everything to do with what's on screen at that moment. There's just a preschooler language to the way things are said, so it's not described to them in kind of tone or in fast-paced adult speak, but more the way a preschool teacher would talk to a kid, which is not speaking down to them at all, but just helping to engage them in what they're seeing. There's participation that we were talking about before, having a social partner on the screen. And then I started just finding myself that if I then later see children enacting, reenacting, using some of the themes that they saw in media in their own pretend play, it seems to be a pretty good sign the kids were getting something from what they saw. I mean, I gotta say, there are some really fun kind of playground reenactments going on out there right now, and they're not right on the storyline of like Dora the Explorer, Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, but once in a while you're like, hey, that came from,
Yeah.
you know, they're riffing on what they say.
Well, I wanted to wait, you have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree?
In English, not child development.
Really?
So, yes, a master's in English.
But you know, I went through a doctoral program at Psych, and I learned a whole bunch from this. And having gone through that process, I'd like to. I think you should get a doctorate. As a matter of fact, there's a new series of DVDs out that you can just watch them. And yeah, actually, I'm going to give you a PhD. This official laser printed diploma on fancy paper contains an authentic PhD. Be it known to all Mozart-loving, sleep-deprived parents on this day, the official degree of doctorate has been awarded to Dr. Lisa Guernsey, PhD, for darn clear writing, checking your references, and exhibiting scholarly behaviors unusual in even most graduate school settings. Pending appropriate matriculation of your keys in New York City following the schools of learning, Baby Einstein, Smarter Baby College. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
So, seriously, it was something for your wall. The kids will say, yeah, you can call me doctor. You can get those online too, probably.